Good morning, dear people of the internet, and welcome to the internet, or more specifically, the weird shenanigans people get up to on the internet. Today we are talking about zine culture because my friend sent me this thing where someone within the zine community was acting very entitled in a way. And before we get into that, we need a lot more context about zine culture because I like talking about that, and also I like people to know about that, and also it's important for the context of this drama thing going around. Before we get into that, I have a very short public service announcement. I'm trying to gather 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so if you could subscribe, that would be absolutely very helpful and very wonderful. And also, if you just like hearing about weird internet shenanigans, this is the place to be. So welcome. And now let's go back in time to the 1930s. The word zine is short for fan magazine, and it refers to a booklet full of comics, poetry, stories, art, and whatnot, and is often recognized by having a handmade look, but not always. They can have all sorts of shapes, sizes, and whatever. And to give you an idea, I have my own little zine collection. I started collecting them like literally this year, so I don't have a lot yet, but still enough to show you. This one is a comic zine. It was way too cheap for how detailed it is. It looks so cool. So this is a comic zine. It has a comic inside of it. These two are made by different people, but both on the risograph. That's a printer that overlays colors and it gives very cool art. These are both full with art in very wild colors, so that's also very cool. This one is different because it's small and it's a pocket guide to boundaries, and it's just very informative and beautiful. This one is about critters and tells a small story with drawings about critters, literally. I got this one because I hate carrots, so I found it funny to get this one. And it's very cool because this person also made this very cool poster on the inside, so that's also wonderful. This one is on how to draw a goblin. This is a story illustrated. It looks very small, but it is very thick, about sweaters. This one is about anxiety. It's very personal but very beautiful. It's about bodies and anxiety. And then I have this one about communication, which is also very cool and printed on very different paper than all of these. It's very shiny, so that's also wonderful. Like, there are so many different kinds, and these are just the ones I got because I liked how they looked and felt. So it's also very personal on what you want, and there's something for everyone, I would say. So that's absolutely wonderful. And since I'm majoring in making comics, I also make them myself. I have these three, they are up in my shop, but I also wanted to show you them because zines, you can make them very easily, and these are printed with the big printer, but you can also make them by just drawing on a piece of paper, literally. But this one, it has a comic and it's called A Very Hot Day. This one is a personal story about my experience with ADHD and also just awareness of ADHD, because there are a lot of things that people don't know about ADHD. And this one is about the feeling that you want to be a turtle, which makes sense because it's called Turtle Envy and it just has illustrations and text. So I like making them myself too. They're very nice to make. I said we had to go to the 1930s for the start of zine culture, but we really have to take a step even further back to 1517, when Martin Luther published a list of demands for the church because the church wasn't behaving well according to him, and people say that this can be seen as the first zine. However, I'm not entirely sure because the word zine didn't exist back then, and it wasn't really the start of the rise of zine culture. So I think we have to really be in the 1930s for the start of zine culture. In the 1930s, the zine The Comet came out, which was a place for science fiction fans to correspond with each other. It had articles and letters from fans, so people could talk about their hobby with each other and read about it, of course. The idea came from a science fiction pulp magazine that had a page dedicated to messages from fans. The Comet inspired a lot of people to make other fanzines that were science fiction themed, so that's cool. Around this time, a bunch of new printing techniques also came out, including something called the mimeograph, which allowed people to make a stencil with a typewriter and then use the stencil to make about 5,000 copies of this stencil. I assume that made printing a lot more affordable, and another thing about zines is that they're often, but not always, cheaply made, because they're made to be distributed and not to make you great amounts of money. When people are selling their zines now, they ask money for it, and they might seem expensive, but printing and drawing and making art in general just takes a lot of time, expertise, and also resources, so it is expensive enough, and people are not really making a profit when they're selling zines most of the times, even though in a lot of cases they are, I think, allowed to make a profit in this economy. Since most of the early zines were science fiction themed, it probably wouldn't be a surprise to you when I say that zine culture really spiked after 1966 when Star Trek started coming out. Star Trek was really a frontrunner in terms of diversity and progressiveness, and I coincidentally made a video about that a few weeks ago, which is linked in the description if you want to see that. It's really interesting. But anyways, the need for more diversity in media didn't end in the end of the episode. The audience wanted more. It was in Star Trek fanzines where the very popular and gay friendship of Spock and Charlie Kirk came to be. Before being or acting, I guess, gay was even allowed in most of the US, because that happened in 2003. Being gay was only allowed in the states Cincinnati and Illinois at the time, and I assume this Spock and Kirk ship went beyond Illinois and Cincinnati. I'm not just talking about gay rights because it's fun and interesting, actually it's kind of depressing, but after World War II, the US kind of started a war on the contents of comics. In 1954, the Comics Code Act came into play, banning anything that was seen as violent or obscene in comics. At the time, a lot of people saw the medium as targeted to children, even though there already were comics targeted at any audience. The censoring didn't start in 1954, people were already burning comics for this reason before that happened, which is very sad. If you have ever opened another comic than Donald Duck, you will understand that comics are a great medium to explore topics that could be seen as violent or obscene. The text-image combination works great for that. In the 50s, people thought that this would be bad for children, and even though there were comics that were clearly targeted to adults, they also thought this about comics that were made for children. It's something in the same vein as saying that Fortnite makes children grow up to be extremely violent, which has been proven wrong, I believe. Anyhow, amidst this censorship situation, the first queer zine was published. In 1948, a zine called Vice Versa, made by 888, was published, and it had film and theater reviews, poetry, and other articles targeted at a lesbian audience. The queer stuff would fall into the extreme obscenity category at this time, even though it was simply about society from a queer point of view. This is a perfect example of the reaction on all of this censorship, because self-publishing was the easiest or honestly only way to circumvent public publishing companies. This led to a surge in zine culture outside of science fiction as a reaction to the Comics Code Act and censorship in publishing in general. This also shows that zine culture has always been a safe place for queer people to publish stuff about being queer, which was not just fun, but it was also very necessary. In the 80s, the US was dealing with the AIDS crisis rather badly, and this was also very bad for the LGBTQ+ community. There was a gigantic lack of education, so zines were made and spread with information about AIDS, HIV, and safe ways for queer people to intermingle. So the queer zine community wasn't only the place to be if you wanted queer representation, it was also literally life-saving. Another community that used zines to give themselves a voice were the Riot Girls, a feminist movement in the male-dominated punk culture. They distributed zines to fight against sexism and for freedom within the punk community, which makes a lot of sense because activism and punk and literally using your voice to voice society's problems is inherent in punk subculture. So you would say that feminism also has a place within that. Now, distributing something self-published is a lot harder than when you have a publisher with connections. 888, the person that made the first queer zine, did it by just giving the zines to her friends and trusting her friends to spread them even further. Science fiction zines were often spread at conventions, which were a thing starting in the 1930s, and zines also found their space in underground comics culture. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the internet became more and more accessible for everyone, which means there was a new and even cheaper way to distribute zines. Internet zines came into play and had poetry, art, and stories just like any other zine. Now, I personally like having print zines more than internet zines because for me, zines is about activism and going against the grain. And I can hold this in my hand, and it's a lot harder for someone to take it away from me than it is on the internet. Things can disappear on the internet. Also, zines are a lot more accessible because of the internet, because you can read them for free, so that also has its value. For the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about an internet zine that I think does not count as a zine. This zine is more organized than just one person publishing their own thoughts and art, like a lot of zines have. You can send in your submissions and they will publish them, or not, based on their rules and the amount of submissions they get. So that every edition is a compilation of art made by different artists, which is very cool. Most of these zines have rules for submissions, mostly for formatting, and most of them also have a theme you have to adhere to, which makes a lot of sense because you cannot publish a zine that has 20-50 50-page stories. That would be an entire book of short stories. However, I got sent the rules of this zine called the Horror Zine, and they didn't make sense at all. Before we go through all of these rules, we need to know a little bit more about horror. Genres don't have strict rules. I think they are there to give the audience a general idea of what they're getting into. But that also means that you have to do something with these expectations when you're a writer. For example, you cannot say you've written a romantasy when you've written a book about an asexual person inventing a flying machine. So when I read or look at the art on the website of the Horror Zine, I would expect to be confronted with my innermost fears, because that is what horror is all about. Horror only works when you can genuinely scare people. This means writing about murderers, violence, uncontrollable illnesses, scary political situations, etc. Because that is what people are scared of. Common tropes in horror are often uncomfortable from a societal perspective, and they are supposed to be, which is again uncomfortable, but it's also kind of the point. Horror isn't meant to get you into a comfy, cozy, toasty, sleepy mood. On the Horror Zine website, the rules open with: the Horror Zine doesn't accept any materials that contain sexually explicit or adult content. Now, I want to give you a few examples that doesn't fit these rules in horror media, but I don't consume a lot of horror media because I love being comfy, cozy, toasty, and sleepy at all times. So I hope that the examples that the internet gave me are not too niche. Also, most of these, if not all of these, will be movies, because movies are a medium that work great for horror because of the music. That adds a lot to the horror. That doesn't mean that other mediums are bad for horror, but movie examples have the most famous examples. Back to the explicit content rule, horror is a great way to explore any intimate topics, because in intimacy, power can be at play, and that can be very scary, and in other plots, intimacy can make the connection between characters a lot stronger, which makes the stakes of losing each other a lot higher. This kind of explicit content had its place in horror since Psycho came out in 1960, with productions such as Ginger Snaps, The Antichrist, and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, amongst an almost infinite amount of other things. The second rule is no or harming of children. However, exploring childhood trauma is also very commonly done in horror movies. Examples are The People Under the Stairs, in which children are locked in a basement after being kidnapped, and The Changeling, in which we follow the ghost of a 6-year-old boy that has been drowned by his father. I would say that the show Wednesday also fits into this category, even though it's more of a comedy show with sporadic horror elements. The next thing that's not allowed is which doesn't work for the same reasons why exploring intimacy works very well in horror. Gore for gore's sake or splatterpunk is also not allowed. Splatterpunk is horror, but with more of what is not allowed according to the Horror Zine. I think the phrasing of gore for gore's sake means that they know that gore is very usual in horror. However, the way they phrased it is very ambiguous. Opinions on how much gore is too much gore can vary a lot, and arguably gore is always gore for gore's sake. I don't think gore is necessary in horror stories, but almost all horror stories, if not all of them, will get a lot worse if you take all the gore out, because it makes it less scary. The next things that are not allowed are political and religious content, which is weird because even I know that a lot of horror stories are made around religious themes. Whenever I doom scroll on Netflix trying to find something to watch, I always come across a lot of horror movies about nuns for some reason. And horror is a great place to also explore demons, for example, because they are scary. And no political themes is even weirder, because if you ask me, art is inherently political. Art doesn't always have to be about politics, but it should be a free space to explore politics. And it's very important to have art in society to hold a mirror up to society, and a lot of it is about politics. Especially in horror, because politics are scary. One of the most famous horror stories of all time, The Handmaid's Tale, is all about this. In an earlier version I saw of these rules, serial killers and slashers were also not allowed. Luckily they changed that, because they are the first things I think about when I think about horror, and I assume I'm not the only one. Now, I really understand not wanting to support the glorification of these themes, but that's a different thing. I also don't want these things to be glorified, because they are terrible when they happen in real life, and they do. Intimacy, politics, and religion can be good, of course, but not in this context. I assume we are just talking about the bad stuff here. All of these things in this context are supposed to be bad, and they are, again, bad when they happen in real life, but also, again, that is kind of the point of horror. Nobody, I hope, is making any good horror stories where these themes are being glorified. What horror artists are doing with these themes is bringing them to the attention of people and showing how scary they actually are, which I would say is very necessary and more useful than not talking about these topics at all. On the Tumblr screenshots my friend sent me, this picture was shared of the only thing that was supposed to be allowed on this website is Clifford's first Halloween. And I sort of agree with that. It begs the question of how this internet scene is even functioning. The user interface doesn't look like it has been updated since its launch in 2009, and yet I'm talking about it 16 years later, which means that submissions are still open and being published on this website every single month. According to the creator, the scene has won multiple prizes from the Predators and Editors Critters Workshop, and I couldn't find anything about this prize, but I did find that the Predators and Editors website has been out of use for several years, so it makes little sense that they won it in 2024, which is only a year ago. And the website of Critters Workshop also looks like it hasn't been updated since 1995. It has had updates, but it's not a very good working website when you want to find any information about anything they do. This doesn't mean that the prize isn't real, because I don't know these people in real life and what they are doing outside of their website, but having "I won this prize" on your website means that you want to claim credibility by having won this prize. And I am questioning the credibility of this prize in the wider internet space or horror space or whatever. If nobody has won about the prize, I can say, "Here you have a prize" to my friend, but then the prize is about nothing without any context that we can know of. So it's not credible at all. But I'm not entirely sure about that, but I do find it weird. I do think these people can focus on making their zine better functioning rather than claiming to have won prizes that are not very credible to the outside human eye. There's an argument to be made that if you're doing something and you like doing it and you're not harming anyone, you should keep doing it. But I do think that the strict rules of the horror zine are actually harmful to the zine community and to the genre of horror. Maybe they are not having a very big impact, but an impact is still an impact. As we have seen, zine culture is all about stepping outside of censorship rules and therefore creative freedom. We have also seen that horror is about creating fear in people, with topics that are really scary and often taboo. So I think we can conclude here that the horror scene is not really doing a great job about being open to the horror genre or zine culture, and I doubt it's even a zine at all. It is, in a technical sense, but it kind of ends there. Actual censorship within the zine community is a very bad idea, and I hope nobody gets any ideas from this. I'm curious to hear what you think about all of this. Thank you for watching, and if you liked my little video, please press the wonderful like and subscribe buttons, and then I will see you next time. Ciao!